Hello everyone and welcome to Night Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment, letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this kind of videos, because I have more for you. Story 1. The Whisper in the Walls. The Victorian house sat on the edge of a small town, half hidden by overgrown bushes and shrouded in the mist that rolled in every evening. To Lila, it was perfect. She'd been searching for a place to escape the chaos of the city, and this house, with its creaky charm and timeless architecture, offered her the peace she craved. The first few nights in her new home were uneventful. She spent her days unpacking, and her evenings curled up with a book by the fireplace. But as the sun dipped below the horizon on her fourth night, she noticed something strange. It began as faint murmurs. Lila was in the living room when she thought she heard a voice, a whisper so soft it could have been the wind. She paused, holding her breath, but the sound stopped. Shrugging it off, she went to bed. That night, she woke to the same sound. This time it was louder, more distinct. Words. Someone or something was speaking. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and strained her ears. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, threading through the wooden beams and plaster. She's here now. She doesn't know yet. Lila froze. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes darted around the darkened room. Who was here? What didn't she know? The next morning, she convinced herself it had been a dream. Moving into a new house was stressful. Maybe her mind was playing tricks on her. But as the day went on, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old pipes made her jump. By nightfall, her nerves were frayed. As she lay in bed, the whispers returned. This time they didn't stop when she stirred. Lila. Her name. The sound of it whispered from the walls made her skin crawl. Summoning her courage, she whispered back, "Who are you?" The house fell silent. For a moment, Lila thought she might have imagined it. But then, clear as day, a voice responded, "Look closer." The next day, Lila couldn't focus on anything else. She scoured the house, tapping on walls, searching for hidden speakers or some logical explanation. In one corner of the dining room, she found something odd, a patch of wallpaper that didn't quite match the rest. It was slightly raised, as though it was covering something. Her curiosity overtook her fear. She fetched a knife and carefully peeled back the paper, revealing a small hidden door. The door was old, its wood darkened with age, and its handle rusted. It took all her strength to force it open. Inside was a room no larger than a closet. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of mildew made her nose wrinkle. The room was filled with dolls, dozens of them, arranged neatly on shelves. At first they seemed like ordinary antiques, but as Lila stepped closer, she realized something was off. The dolls' eyes were too realistic, their glassy surfaces reflecting the faint light in the room. One doll in particular caught her attention, a porcelain figure dressed in a blue dress, its head tilted slightly to the side. As Lila stared, the doll's head moved. It turned, ever so slowly, to face her. She stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. She told herself it wasn't possible. She must have imagined it. But then, in a voice that was impossibly soft, yet unmistakably clear, the doll whispered, "We've been waiting." The air in the room grew cold. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her as she backed away. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing from the walls and the tiny mouths of the dolls. "You shouldn't have come here. You can't leave now." Lila ran from the room, slamming the hidden door shut behind her. But the whispers followed. They filled the house, growing louder and more insistent. She fled to the living room, clutching her phone to call for help, but the screen flickered, and died. The lights in the house began to flicker too, plunging her into darkness. And then, from the corner of the room, she saw it. The doll in the blue dress. It stood there on its own, staring at her with unblinking eyes. Lila screamed, but no one could hear her. Story 2. Midnight Visitor. Sophie had never liked thunderstorms. The flashes of lightning and rolling booms of thunder always made her feel small and vulnerable. So when the storm rolled in late that evening, she was grateful for her new apartment's thick curtains and soundproof windows. It was her first night living alone, and she was determined not to let her fear of storms ruin it. She curled up on the couch with a mug of tea and her favorite book, trying to ignore the distant rumbles outside. The night wore on, and Sophie eventually drifted off to sleep. She woke to a strange sound, a soft tapping. At first, she thought it was the storm, but as she sat up and listened, she realized the sound wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from her window. Her stomach twisted. She lived on the 12th floor. Slowly, Sophie turned to face the window. The tapping stopped. She stared at the curtains, her mind racing. It had to be her imagination. There was no way someone could be outside her window at this height. But then, the tapping started again, more insistent. The tapping grew louder, each knock more forceful than the last. Sophie's pulse quickened. She clutched the blanket around her shoulders and whispered to herself, "It's the wind. It's just the wind." But deep down, she knew better. Summoning her courage, Sophie crept toward the window. Her bare feet made no sound against the wooden floor, and the air in the room felt colder with each step. She hesitated in front of the curtains, her hand trembling as she reached out. Before she could pull them back, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on her like a weight. Sophie stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly she leaned closer, pressing her ear to the fabric. That's when she heard it. A voice. Faint, but unmistakable. "Sophie." She stumbled backward, a scream caught in her throat. The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was there. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't her imagination. Gathering her courage, Sophie grabbed a flashlight from the table and yanked the curtains open. Her heart stopped. A woman was floating outside her window. Her face was pale, almost translucent, with hollow black eyes and a wide, unnatural smile that stretched across her face. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands, and her tattered dress fluttered in the wind. She pressed a hand against the glass, her long, bony fingers leaving smudges on the pane. The woman's mouth moved, forming words that Sophie couldn't hear. Terrified, Sophie dropped the flashlight and stumbled back. "This isn't real," she whispered. "It can't be real." The woman's smile widened. Her voice echoed in Sophie's mind, though her lips didn't move. "Let me in, Sophie. I know you're lonely." Sophie's breath hitched. She shook her head violently, backing further away. "No! No, leave me alone!" The woman's expression shifted. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of cold anger. Her hollow eyes bore into Sophie's as she slammed her hand against the glass. The sound echoed through the apartment, louder than thunder. The glass cracked under the pressure, thin spiderweb lines spreading across the window. Sophie turned and bolted for the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. She locked it and pressed her back against the wood, her chest heaving. The tapping began again. This time it came from the bedroom window. Sophie's blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her eyes darting to the second window. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the faint outline of the woman's face pressed against the glass. "Let me in, Sophie," the voice called again, louder this time. The woman's shadow moved, and suddenly, the window shattered. Shards of glass rained onto the floor as the woman climbed inside, her movements slow and deliberate. Sophie screamed, scrambling toward the bathroom. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The sound of bare feet on the floor outside made her stomach churn. "You can't hide from me," the voice said, now raspy and cold. The doorknob rattled. Sophie pressed herself against the wall, her eyes darting around for a weapon. Her gaze landed on the shower rod. She yanked it down, clutching it like a makeshift spear. The rattling stopped. The silence stretched on, broken only by Sophie's ragged breathing. She dared to hope that the woman was gone. Then, from behind her, she heard a soft whisper. "Found you." Sophie spun around, but it was too late. Story 3. The lake's reflection. Jonah had always found peace by the lake. It was a serene spot tucked deep in the forest, far from the noise of the town. The lake was still and pristine, with a surface so smooth it mirrored the sky perfectly. For Jonah, it wasn't just a place to fish, it was an escape. One moonlit evening, he packed his gear and headed there after a particularly rough day. The silver light from the full moon bathed the lake in an eerie glow, but Jonah didn't mind. He loved fishing at night. It was quiet, and he often caught the biggest fish then. He set up his rod and cast his line, settling into the familiar rhythm of waiting. Hours passed, and Jonah caught a few decent fish, but nothing to brag about. Still, the calm of the lake was enough for him. As the night deepened, Jonah decided to take a break. He leaned over the edge of the dock to refill his water bottle from the lake, something he'd done countless times. But this time, as he peered into the water, he noticed something strange. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't right. Jonah wasn't looking directly into the water. He was turned slightly to the side, but his reflection was staring straight at him. He froze, his heart pounding. It had to be a trick of the light or his tired eyes playing tricks on him. Tentatively, he waved a hand. The reflection waved back, perfectly in sync. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the surface. Then the reflection smirked. Jonah stumbled back, nearly falling off the dock. His reflection in the lake remained, grinning up at him, even as he scrambled to his feet. No way, he muttered, rubbing his eyes. When he looked again, the reflection was gone, and the lake appeared normal. Trying to shake off the unease, Jonah packed up his gear. It was late, and he needed sleep. But as he made his way back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching him. When he reached his vehicle, he glanced at the rearview mirror. For a split second, he saw it again, his reflection, grinning unnaturally wide. He whipped around, but the road behind him was empty. That night, Jonah couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt that smirking face lurking just out of sight. By the time dawn broke, he was exhausted, but determined to prove to himself that he wasn't losing his mind. The next night, he returned to the lake. The air was colder than usual, and a thin fog clung to the ground. Jonah approached the water cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The lake was unnaturally still. No ripples, no sounds of frogs or crickets, just silence. Jonah leaned over the edge, his flashlight illuminating the water. His reflection was there again, staring up at him. This time it didn't mimic his movements. It moved independently, tilting its head to the side and raising a finger to its lips in a mock gesture of silence. "What do you want?" Jonah whispered, his voice trembling. The reflection mouthed something, but Jonah couldn't make it out. Slowly it began to sink beneath the surface, its eyes never leaving his. Then, without warning, a pale hand shot out of the water and grabbed Jonah's arm. He screamed, stumbling backward as the grip tightened. He could feel the icy cold of the hand, the unnatural strength pulling him toward the lake. Jonah fought back, kicking and thrashing until the hand released him. He scrambled away, his heart pounding in his chest. When he looked back at the water, The surface was calm, as if nothing had happened. But he knew better. The lake wasn't just a peaceful spot anymore. Something lived there, something that had taken an interest in him. And as he drove away, his reflection in the rearview mirror winked. Story 4. The Forgotten Child. Emma had always believed her son, Max, was imaginative. At 6 years old, his world was filled with imaginary friends, adventures, and make-believe games. When he started talking about a new friend named Eli, she didn't think much of it. "Eli says he likes my room," Max told her one evening at dinner. Emma smiled. "That's nice. Is Eli a bear or a knight this time?" Max frowned, as if confused by the question. "He's just Eli. He doesn't like to pretend." That gave Emma pause. Most of Max's imaginary friends had some fantastical element to them: pirates, astronauts, or talking animals. But she brushed it off as another phase. For weeks, Eli was a constant presence in their home. Max would set an extra plate at the table for him, talk to him while playing with his toys, and even insist that Eli needed the nightlight on. Then strange things started happening. Emma woke up one night to the sound of Max talking in his room. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Quietly, she got out of bed and crept down the hallway. As she neared Max's door, she heard him say, "Okay, Eli, but Mommy wouldn't like that." A chill ran down her spine. She peeked inside the room. Max was sitting on the floor, facing the corner. His back was to her, and he was holding one of his toy cars. "Max," she whispered. He turned his head slightly but didn't look at her. "Eli says you shouldn't come in, Mommy." Her blood ran cold. She flicked on the light and stepped into the room. "Sweetheart, it's late. You need to go back to bed." Max finally turned to face her, his eyes wide. "Eli doesn't like you." Emma felt an inexplicable wave of unease. She tucked Max back into bed, kissed his forehead, and tried to shake the feeling. But sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, Emma noticed something odd. The word Eli was scratched into the wall next to Max's bed. The grooves were deep, as if made by sharp nails. She asked Max about it, but he just shrugged. "Eli said he wanted his name there," he said casually. Emma's unease grew. She tried to dismiss it, but more strange occurrences followed. The TV would flicker on by itself, toys would move to different spots overnight, and Max's cheerful laughter would suddenly turn into conversations with long pauses, as if he were listening to someone unseen. One night, Emma woke to the sound of faint scratching. She sat up in bed, her heart racing. The noise seemed to be coming from Max's room. She grabbed her phone for light and hurried down the hall. As she reached Max's door, the scratching stopped. Slowly, she opened the door and shone her phone's light around the room. Max was asleep in his bed, but the word Eli had been scratched into the wall again, this time in jagged, overlapping lines. Her stomach churned. She approached Max and gently shook him awake. "Sweetheart, did you scratch the wall again?" Max blinked up at her groggily. "No, Mommy. Eli did." "Max," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Eli isn't real." Max's expression darkened. "Don't say that. He'll hear you." Before Emma could respond, the closet door creaked open. Emma's breath hitched as the door swung wider, revealing nothing but darkness. She grabbed Max and pulled him out of bed, backing toward the door. The room suddenly grew colder, and the air felt heavy. A voice, low and guttural, came from the closet. "You shouldn't have said that." Emma screamed and bolted down the hall with Max in her arms. They spent the rest of the night in the car, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The next day, Emma called a contractor to repair Max's room. When the workers peeled back the wallpaper, they found something horrifying: scratches covering every inch of the wall. Most were nonsensical marks, but in the center, carved deeply into the wood, was a message. "I'm still here." Emma moved out of the house that same week, but even in their new home, Max would sometimes stare at the corner of his room and whisper, "Eli says hi." Story 5. Room 404. Ben hated business trips, especially ones that required overnight stays in unfamiliar hotels. But work was work, and his boss had insisted he attend the conference. After a long day of travel and meetings, Ben was ready to check in and crash for the night. The hotel was ordinary, almost bland, a chain establishment with neutral-toned carpets and generic art on the walls. Ben approached the front desk, where a bored-looking clerk greeted him. "Reservation under Ben Harper," he said, setting his briefcase down. The clerk typed into the computer, her nails clicking against the keyboard. After a moment, she frowned. "You're in room 404. "Great," Ben said, reaching for his credit card. The clerk hesitated. "Are you sure you don't want 405 instead? It's available." Ben raised an eyebrow. "What's wrong with 404? The clerk glanced around nervously, then leaned in and lowered her voice. "Some guests say it's strange." Ben chuckled. "Strange how?" She shrugged, clearly uncomfortable. "Just, people say they hear things, see things. But if you don't believe in that kind of stuff, it's probably nothing." Ben smirked. "I think I'll be fine. Thanks." The clerk reluctantly handed him the keycard. "If you change your mind, let me know." Ben headed to the elevator, shaking his head at the clerk's superstitions. Ghost stories, he thought. There's always one at every hotel. When he reached the 4th floor, he found room 404 at the end of the hall. The hallway was eerily quiet, the muted buzz of the fluorescent lights the only sound. Ben slid the keycard into the lock, opened the door, and stepped inside. The room was unremarkable. Standard-issue hotel furniture, beige walls, and a single window overlooking the city. Tossing his suitcase onto the bed, Ben kicked off his shoes and turned on the TV for some background noise. As he settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling that the room was off. The air felt heavier, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should be. But he brushed it off as exhaustion. Around 11 p.m., Ben turned off the lights and climbed into bed. The city lights outside cast a faint glow through the curtains, and the hum of the air conditioning was oddly soothing. But just as he was drifting off, a noise jolted him awake. Knock, knock. Ben opened his eyes and stared at the door. Someone was knocking, soft but deliberate. He glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. "Who the hell?" he muttered, climbing out of bed. He peered through the peephole, but the hallway was empty. "Great," he said, rubbing his temples. "Some idiot playing pranks." He climbed back into bed, but the moment he closed his eyes, the knocking resumed. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder. Ben's irritation turned to unease. He grabbed his phone and opened the door, ready to catch whoever was responsible. But the hallway was still empty. As he stood there, he noticed something strange. The hallway seemed longer than before. The light at the far end flickered, casting eerie shadows. Shaking his head, Ben closed the door and locked it. "Just tired," he told himself. But when he turned around, the room was different. The furniture was gone, the walls were bare, and the beige paint had been replaced by peeling gray wallpaper. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rust. "Okay, what the hell?" Ben whispered, backing toward the door. The TV flickered on, static filling the room. A distorted voice crackled through the speakers. "You shouldn't be here." Ben's pulse raced. He grabbed his suitcase and bolted for the door, but the doorknob wouldn't turn. He yanked and pulled, but it was stuck fast. Behind him, the static grew louder. He turned to see the shadow of a figure on the TV screen. The figure stepped closer, its outline becoming clearer. A tall, gaunt shape with hollow eyes and a wide, toothy grin. The lights in the room began to flicker. The shadow on the screen twisted and jerked unnaturally, as if it were trying to climb out of the TV. "Let me out!" Ben screamed, pounding on the door. The knocking from earlier returned, but now it was coming from inside the room. Ben spun around, his back against the door. The shadowy figure was gone from the TV, but the room was no longer empty. Shapes moved in the darkness, humanoid figures, their eyes glowing faintly. One of them stepped forward, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide as it rasped, "Room 404 is ours." Ben's screams echoed through the empty hallway. The next morning, the cleaning staff found room 404 empty. The bed was untouched, the suitcase was gone, and there was no sign of Ben Harper. When the front desk clerk checked the records, she frowned. Room 404 hadn't been rented out in years.